On the night of August 21st, 1968, 6-year-old Natalino Mele woke up in the back seat of his mother's Alfa Romeo Giulietta in a remote parking area near Signa, a small town outside Florence. The car was filled with an eerie silence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His mother, Barbara Locci, and her lover, Antonio Lobianco, lay dead in the front seats, both killed by gunshots from a .22 caliber Beretta pistol. The killer had approached the car while the couple was intimate, firing through the passenger window with cold precision. Natalino stumbled out of the car and walked nearly 3 kilometers in his pajamas to the nearest farmhouse, where he knocked on the door and told the startled residents, "My daddy is sick and my mommy is sleeping." The child had no way of knowing that he had just become the first witness to what would become Italy's most infamous, unsolved serial killer case, a 17-year reign of terror that would claim 16 lives and forever change how the world understood the psychology of serial murder. This was the beginning of the Monster of Florence case, though it would be 6 years before investigators realized they were dealing with a serial killer. The Monster of Florence, Il Mostro di Firenze, is the name coined by the Italian media for a serial killer active within the province of Florence between 1968 and 1985. The monster murdered 16 victims, usually young couples secluded in search of intimacy in wooded areas during new moons. Investigator, the psychological profile suggests someone who derives satisfaction not just from killing, but from the violation of intimacy itself, a voyeur who transforms observation into destruction. The Monster of Florence terrorized the rolling hills and cypress-lined roads of Tuscany for nearly 2 decades, targeting young couples who sought privacy in the region's secluded lovers' lanes. What made this case particularly chilling was not just the brutality of the murders, but the calculated ritualistic behavior that accompanied each attack. The killer possessed an almost supernatural ability to appear and disappear in the darkness, leaving behind only death and forensic evidence that would frustrate investigators for decades. Unlike many serial killers who escalate quickly or operate in dense urban environments, the monster demonstrated remarkable patience and geographic knowledge. The murders were committed in the countryside around Florence during new moons, suggesting the killer understood that these were the darkest nights when couples would be most vulnerable and witnesses least likely. This level of planning indicated a methodical intelligence that would make the case one of criminology's most studied examples of organized serial killing. After the 1968 murder of Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco, the case initially appeared to be a crime of passion. Barbara's husband, Stefano Mele, was arrested and confessed to the killing, claiming he had murdered his unfaithful wife and her lover in a fit of jealous rage. The case seemed closed, and Stefano was sentenced to prison for the double homicide. However, investigators had failed to recognize several crucial details that would later prove significant. The murder weapon, a .22 caliber Beretta pistol loaded with Winchester bullets, had been fired with unusual precision. The killer had approached the car methodically, firing through the passenger window in a pattern that suggested familiarity with firearms and a coldly calculated approach rather than a crime of passion. More disturbing was evidence that the killer had lingered at the scene, possibly observing the couple before the attack. These details were overlooked in the rush to close what appeared to be a straightforward domestic homicide. For 6 years, the Tuscan countryside remained quiet. Then, on September 14, 1974, the monster struck again. Though investigators wouldn't immediately connect this second attack to the 1968 murder, Giovanni Foggi and Carmela De Nuccio, both 19 years old, had driven to a secluded area near Borgo San Lorenzo for a romantic evening when they were approached by the killer. The victims were all couples, killed with the same Beretta pistol. Most were attacked in cars during or just after having sex, Foggy was shot 3 times while Carmela was shot twice before being dragged from the car. The killer then performed his first known mutilation, using a knife to remove portions of Carmela's breast and genitalia with surgical precision. This ritualistic element would become the monster's signature, distinguishing these murders from simple robbery or passion killings. Ballistics testing revealed that the bullets matched those from the 1968 Loculo Bianco murders, proving that Stefano Mele could not have been the original killer since he was still in prison. This discovery transformed the investigation from a closed domestic case into an active serial killer hunt. The revelation that the same weapon had been used 6 years apart suggested either that the real killer had remained dormant or that the weapon had changed hands within a criminal network. The monster's next attack came on June 6, 1981, in the hills near Scandicci. Stefania Pettini, 18, and Pasquale Gentilcore, 19, had parked their Fiat 127 in a secluded area when the killer approached under cover of darkness. Both victims were shot multiple times with the signature .22 caliber Beretta. After killing Pasquale, the monster dragged Stefania approximately 50 meters from the car, where he performed extensive mutilations using a knife with a serrated blade. The ritualistic nature of Stefania's injuries revealed disturbing details about the killer's psychology. The mutilations were performed with deliberate precision, suggesting the killer possessed anatomical knowledge or at least significant experience with cutting instruments. More chilling was the evidence that the killer had spent considerable time at the scene, indicating he felt completely secure in these remote locations and derived satisfaction from his ritualistic behavior. The monster remained silent for a year before striking again on October 23, 1981. Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, both 26, had driven to a parking area near Calenzano when they were attacked. The killer's methodology remained consistent: shots fired through the car window, followed by the removal of the female victim for mutilation. However, this attack introduced a new element that would become central to understanding the monster's psychology. After killing both victims, the monster removed a portion of Susanna's breast and sent it through the mail to investigating prosecutor Silvia Della Monica. The package, postmarked 3 days after the murder, contained no letter or explanation, just a grotesque trophy wrapped in a piece of green fabric. This act of sending body parts to authorities demonstrated that the monster was not only aware of the investigation, but was actively taunting law enforcement. The mailing of body parts represented a significant escalation in the killer's behavior, transforming him from a secretive predator into someone who craved public attention and psychological dominance over the investigation. Criminal psychologists noted that this behavior indicated the monster possessed sufficient intelligence to follow media coverage of his crimes and felt confident enough in his abilities to openly challenge authorities. By 1982, panic had begun to spread throughout Tuscany. Young couples avoided secluded areas, and those who continued to seek privacy in rural locations often traveled in groups or carried weapons. The monster's ability to strike without warning and disappear without trace had created an atmosphere of terror that extended far beyond the immediate crime scenes. On June 19, 1982, the monster claimed his next victims: Paolo Mainardi, 22, and Antonella Migliorini, 20. The couple had parked near Montespertoli when the killer approached their car. Paolo was shot 4 times and died instantly, while Antonella was shot twice before being dragged from the vehicle. The mutilations performed on Antonella were the most extensive yet, suggesting the killer was becoming more confident and ritualistic in his behavior. This murder scene yielded the first significant forensic evidence that would later prove crucial to the investigation. Investigators found footprints in the soft earth near the car, indicating the killer wore size 44 shoes with a distinctive tread pattern. More importantly, they discovered tire tracks from the killer's vehicle, suggesting he drove a small car, possibly a Fiat or similar European model. However, The sheer number of such vehicles in Italy made this lead nearly impossible to pursue effectively. The monster's next attack, on September 9, 1983, near Galuzzo, demonstrated his evolving methodology. German tourists Horst Meyer and Uwe Sens had parked their Volkswagen van in what they thought was a safe location when the monster struck. Both men were shot multiple times with the .22 caliber Beretta, but the killer's ritualistic behavior was notably different because both victims were male. The absence of the usual mutilations led some investigators to speculate that the monster had made a mistake, possibly approaching the van without realizing both occupants were men. This theory suggested the killer was specifically targeting heterosexual couples and that the sight of male intimacy had disrupted his psychological ritual. Others argued that the killer had deliberately targeted the German tourists as part of an evolving pattern. On July 29, 1984, near Vicchio di Mugello, the monster struck again with devastating efficiency. Claudio Stefanacci, 21, and Pia Rontini, 18, had driven to a secluded parking area when they were ambushed. Both victims were shot multiple times, and Pia was subjected to the killer's signature mutilations. However, this crime scene provided investigators with their most promising lead yet. A local resident reported seeing a small, dark-colored car leaving the area shortly after the estimated time of the murders. More significantly, investigators found a .22 caliber bullet casing that had been overlooked at previous scenes, providing additional ballistics evidence linking all the murders to the same weapon. The casing bore distinctive markings that would later become crucial in identifying suspect weapons. The monster's final confirmed attack occurred on September 8, 1985, near San Castiano. French tourists Jean-Michel Kravitchvili, 25, and Nadine Morio, 36, had been camping in a small tent when the killer discovered them. Both victims were shot through the tent fabric, demonstrating the monster's adaptability when confronted with a different scenario than his usual car-based attacks. After killing both victims, the monster cut away a section of the tent and dragged Nadine's body into nearby woods, where he performed his ritualistic mutilations. 3 days later, the investigating prosecutor received an envelope containing a portion of Nadine's breast, along with a crude drawing and a few lines of barely legible text that appeared to mock the investigation. This final communication from the monster marked the end of his documented killing spree. After 17 years and 16 victims, the killer simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a forensic puzzle that would consume Italian law enforcement for decades. The abrupt cessation of the murders sparked numerous theories. The killer had died, been imprisoned for other crimes, left the country, or possibly been institutionalized. The investigation that followed would become one of the largest and most controversial in Italian criminal history. After over 100,000 interrogations, multiple suspects, and 2 convictions of guilt, this case is still believed by many to be unsolved. The sheer scope of the investigation reflected both the public pressure to solve the case and the complete lack of viable suspects with concrete connections to all the murders. Several patterns emerged from analysis of the monster's crimes that helped investigators develop a psychological profile. All attacks occurred during new moon periods when darkness was most complete. All victims were young couples seeking privacy in secluded areas. The killer demonstrated intimate knowledge of Tuscan geography, suggesting he was either a local resident or someone with extensive familiarity with the region. The consistent use of the same weapon over 17 years indicated the killer either possessed remarkable self-control or had reliable access to the murder weapon. The monster's methodology also revealed sophisticated planning and preparation. He seemed to scout locations in advance, understanding both the geography and the patterns of couples who frequented these areas. His ability to approach victims undetected suggested either exceptional stealth skills or familiarity with hunting and outdoor activities. The precision of his shooting, even in darkness, indicated significant firearms experience. Because of the case's notoriety and the lack of a definitive solution, numerous suspects were investigated, arrested, and in some cases convicted. The most prominent suspect was Pietro Pacciani, a local farmer with a history of violence against women. In 1994, Pacciani was convicted of the monster murders based largely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony suggesting he had made incriminating statements about the crimes. Pacciani's conviction was controversial from the beginning. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from questionable witnesses, including criminals seeking reduced sentences and neighbors with personal vendettas against Pacciani. Physical evidence linking him directly to the crimes was minimal, consisting primarily of allegations that he owned weapons similar to those used by the monster. In 1996, Pacciani's conviction was overturned on appeal due to insufficient evidence. However, he died of a heart attack in 1998 before a retrial could be completed, ensuring that questions about his guilt would never be definitively resolved. Some investigators remained convinced of his involvement, while others believed he was a scapegoat chosen to satisfy public demand for justice. The investigation then focused on Pacciani's alleged accomplices, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, both local men with criminal backgrounds. Prosecutors theorized that the monster murders were committed by a group rather than an individual, with different members taking turns as the actual killer. This theory was supported by alleged inconsistencies in the murder weapon's ballistics and variations in the killer's methodology. Vanni and Lotti were both convicted in connection with some of the monster murders, but their convictions were also controversial. The evidence against them consisted primarily of confessions that were later recanted and witness testimony of questionable reliability. Critics argued that the investigation had become focused on finding any solution rather than the correct solution, leading to the prosecution of convenient suspects rather than the actual perpetrator. More exotic theories emerged, suggesting the monster murders were connected to occult rituals or international conspiracies. Some investigators proposed that the killer was harvesting body parts for satanic ceremonies or black market organ trafficking. These theories were fueled by the ritualistic nature of the mutilations and the fact that body parts were sometimes missing from crime scenes. The occult theory gained particular traction when investigators discovered that several of the murder locations were near sites with historical connections to witchcraft or pagan rituals. Proponents argued that the timing of the murders around new moons supported this theory, as did the precision of the mutilations and the apparent anatomical knowledge required to perform them. However, forensic psychologists and criminal profilers generally dismissed the occult theories as sensationalized speculation. They argued that the monster's behavior was consistent with a sexually motivated serial killer who derived satisfaction from violating intimate couples, rather than someone participating in organized rituals. The systematic nature of the murders suggested personal psychological needs rather than external religious or commercial motivations. Recent developments in the case have renewed hope for a definitive solution. Newly discovered DNA could shed light on one of Italy's most famous cold cases, finally revealing the monster of Florence serial killer who murdered young couples in the 1970s and 80s. Advanced DNA testing techniques not available during the original investigation are being applied to preserved evidence from the crime scenes. The DNA evidence has already yielded some intriguing results. Genetic material recovered from several crime scenes appears to match, confirming that a single individual was responsible for multiple murders. However, the DNA does not match any of the previously convicted suspects, suggesting that the real monster of Florence was never captured. This revelation has reopened debates about the original investigation and the convictions of Pacciani, Vanni, and Lotti. If the DNA evidence proves that none of these men were involved in the murders, it would represent one of the most significant wrongful conviction scandals in Italian criminal history. It would also mean that the real monster either died undetected or is still alive, having successfully evaded justice for nearly 40 years. The Monster of Florence case has had a profound impact on Italian society and criminal investigation techniques. It demonstrated the challenges of investigating serial crimes in an era before modern forensic science and criminal profiling. The case also highlighted the dangers of public pressure, forcing investigators to pursue convenient suspects rather than following evidence objectively. The murders changed how Italians viewed personal safety and influenced dating behavior for an entire generation. Young couples abandoned traditional lovers' lanes, and rural tourism in Tuscany declined as the region became associated with danger rather than romance. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victims to encompass an entire society that had to confront the reality that such evil could exist in their midst. From a criminological perspective, the Monster of Florence case provided valuable insights into the psychology of organized serial killers. The killer's ability to remain undetected for 17 years while maintaining a consistent methodology demonstrated levels of self-control and planning that challenged existing theories about serial killer behavior. The case also illustrated how geographic knowledge and patience could be more effective than sophistication in evading capture. The case has continued to influence popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and films. Thomas Harris drew inspiration from the monster murders for his novel Hannibal, incorporating the idea of a serial killer who sends body parts to investigators. The case's combination of beautiful Tuscan settings and horrific crimes has proven irresistibly compelling to writers and filmmakers seeking to explore the contrast between surface beauty and hidden evil. The Monster of Florence investigation also revealed troubling aspects of the Italian criminal justice system, including the willingness to convict suspects based on limited evidence when public pressure demanded results. The case became a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining scientific objectivity in high-profile investigations and the dangers of allowing media coverage to influence prosecutorial decisions. Today, nearly 4 decades after the final murder, the Monster of Florence case remains one of Europe's most studied unsolved serial killer cases. The recent DNA developments offer hope for finally identifying the perpetrator, but they also raise questions about how many other aspects of the original investigation may have been flawed. The victims, Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco, Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio, Stefania Pettini and Pasquale Gentilcore, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini, Horst Meyer and Uwe Sens, Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Rontini, Jean-Michel Cravechvili and Nadine Moriot deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by incomprehensible evil. Their killer, whoever he was, managed to terrorize an entire region while demonstrating that even in the modern era, a sufficiently patient and methodical predator could operate with near impunity. The Monster of Florence proved that the romantic notion of Tuscany as a pastoral paradise was just that, a notion that could be shattered by the reality that monsters can lurk even in the most beautiful places on Earth. Whether the recent DNA evidence will finally provide answers to questions that have haunted Italy for decades remains to be seen. What is certain is that the Monster of Florence case will continue to fascinate criminologists, investigators, and the public as long as questions remain unanswered and justice remains elusive in the cypress-shadowed hills, where 16 people lost their lives to satisfy one person's incomprehensible darkness.